Welcome everyone to the Canadian Nurses Association webinar series, Progress in Practice. Today's webinar is an update of Form T2201 Federal Disability Tax Credit Certificate, which is a new authority for nurse practitioners. CNA is very excited to have collaborated with the Canada Revenue Agency staff to present this session. It will be recorded for nurses who are unable to participate today. My name is Josette Roussel, and I'm a Senior Nurse Advisor at the Canadian Nurses Association, and I will be hosting this webinar. At the end of the presentation, we will answer your questions, which will you type on the right-hand side of the screen. We will address as many questions as time allows. And now a little bit of information about our guests and presenters today. Anne-Marie Bainville, Karen Dobson, and Stéphane Laplante. Anne-Marie is a Program Officer in the Disability Programs section of the CRA. She's responsible for communication, including publications, surveys, and web content related to the disability tax credit, and for developing informational web materials. Karen is a Senior Medical Advisor for the CRA. She provides education and support to tax centers and medical practitioners and assists with complex eligibility decisions. Stéphane is a Senior Medical Advisor for the CRA. He started with the CRA as medical adjudicator and has worked in a variety of hospital rehabilitation programs. Without further ado, Karen will start the presentation, and Anne-Marie and Stéphane will answer any questions that may occur during the presentation. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Hello, it's nice to be here. Our first screen is an outline of what we will cover today, and our goal is that you have a good overview of what the disability tax credit includes and how to complete the form T2201. So we're really excited that as of March 22nd of this year, the federal government's budget added nurse practitioners to the list of medical practitioners who can certify eligibility for the disability tax credit for all types of impairments within the scope of your practice. We'll now watch a short video.
Apply for the disability tax credit in 1, 2, 3 easy steps. People who have a severe and prolonged impairment in physical or mental functions often have extra expenses that other taxpayers don't. The disability tax credit helps to offset some of those costs. The disability tax credit is a non-refundable tax credit. This means that when you fill out your income tax and benefit return, the credit reduces the amount of income tax you might have to pay. Applying for the credit is easy. Just follow these 3 steps. Step 1. Fill in the basic personal information on Part A of Form T2201, which is called the Disability Tax Credit Certificate.
When I learned that Emma might be eligible for the disability tax credit, I wanted to apply for it right away. It was easy. I only had to complete Part A of the form with my basic personal information and Emma's, and then I took the form to our medical practitioner.
Step 2. Ask your medical practitioner to fill out Part B of the form. My patients often ask me to complete Part B of Form T2201, so I'm familiar with it. I always tell them applying for the disability tax credit is really a simple and straightforward process. Step 3. Mail the completed and signed form to the Canada Revenue Agency.
My mother's medical practitioner has been a lifeline for her. She helped Mom find support and fill out Form T2201. Now that it's filled out and signed by my mother and her doctor, we just need to mail it to the Canada Revenue Agency.
Life is more challenging for people who have a severe and prolonged impairment in physical or mental functions. Applying for the disability tax credit can provide some relief. You don't need to wait until tax time. Apply anytime to find out if you qualify. Then, when tax time rolls around, we'll be able to process your income tax return faster. Being eligible for the disability tax credit might also open the door to other government programs, including the Registered Disability Savings Plan, the Working Income Tax Benefit, and the Child Disability Benefit. Apply for the disability tax credit today. For more information, go to cra.gc.ca/DTC or call 1-800-959-8281. 3 easy steps. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3.
And there you have it, easy as 1, 2, 3. So just to continue on, the disability tax credit is a non-refundable tax credit that helps persons with disabilities or their supporting family members reduce the amount of income tax they may have to pay. To be eligible, an individual must have a severe and prolonged impairment in physical or mental functions as defined in the Income Tax Act and as certified by a medical practitioner. An individual must apply. So there is an application, it's the form T2201. You must apply for the disability tax credit. And although you may be eligible for other programs, you must know that the criteria is very specific. And even if you are eligible for the Canada Pension Plan, it does not mean that you are eligible for the disability tax credit. So please note that the criteria are very specific. If you are found eligible for the disability tax credit, it can open the door to other government programs, including the Child Disability Benefit, the Working Income Tax Benefit Disability Supplement, and the Registered Disability Savings Plan, as indicated in the video. We're now going to review eligibility. In all cases, the impairment must be prolonged, which means the impairment has lasted or is expected to last at least 12 months, continuous. Also, your patient must meet one of the following criteria: be blind, be markedly restricted in at least one of the basic activities of daily living at least 90% of the time, be significantly restricted in 2 or more of the basic activities of daily living. This can include a vision impairment at least 90% of the time, or need life-sustaining therapy. And we will review all of these in more detail as we go through the presentation. And please note, although your patient may have a diagnosis or an underlying medical condition, it does not necessarily mean that they're eligible for the disability tax credit. They must meet the eligibility criteria to be eligible. Eligibility is based on the effects of the impairment, not on the medical condition or diagnosis. First up is an example of eligibility where 2 individuals with the same medical condition or impairment, with the same medical condition, but they have different effects of impairment. So they both have a restriction in walking in this example. One individual walks slowly, but not so slow that they take an inordinate amount of time. The other individual requires a walker. They have to stop frequently to rest due to shortness of breath or due to pain. So very different effects of impairment. And the term taking an inordinate amount of time will be defined as we go through the presentation. Categories of impairment. Your patient must meet the requirements in one of the following categories. Vision, basic activities of daily living. These include speaking, hearing, walking, elimination, consisting of bowel or bladder functions, feeding, dressing, or mental functions necessary for everyday life. Please note, this does not include working, housework, or participating in social or recreational activities. Cumulative effects of significant restrictions and life-sustaining therapy. So we will now review those categories of impairment in more detail. Vision. In order to qualify for under vision, your patient would need to be blind. That means both eyes are affected. Visual acuity in both eyes would be 20/200, even with correction. So despite wearing glasses, their vision would be 20/200. The other parameter is their field of vision would be 20 degrees or less. So they have to either meet the visual acuity or the visual field in both eyes to be considered blind, to be markedly restricted for the disability tax credit. For basic activities of daily living, your patient must be markedly restricted in at least one of these basic activities of daily living. And this refers to the client is, or the patient is unable to do the basic activity of daily living, or they require an inordinate amount of time to do the basic activity of daily living. An inordinate amount of time means an excessive period of time, a long time to perform this activity. And we have a note here on the slide that refers to 3 times the average time needed to complete the activity. You're using a comparison of a person of the same age who does not have the impairment. So the individual, your patient, would need to be 3 times slower to perform a basic activity of daily living, and this is based on your clinical judgment. Examples of basic activities of daily living. So when we refer to speaking, please remember for all of these, it needs to be prolonged, needs to be severe, needs to be lasting or expected to last a continuous 12 months, and be present 90% of the time. So in our examples, to be markedly restricted for speaking, you would be unable to speak, such that you rely on other means of communication, such as sign language or a symbol board, or you require an inordinate amount of time to speak, which means that it's very difficult for you to make yourself, for your patient to make themselves understood. They have to repeat words and sentences several times so that they take an inordinate amount of time. Moving on to hearing. To be markedly restricted in hearing, your patient would be unable to hear, such that they completely rely on lip reading or sign language at least 90% of the time, even with hearing aids. Or they take an inordinate amount of time. So in your office, your patient asks you to repeat yourself often, very slowly, so that they can understand the conversation. So a lot of repetition is required. They are taking an inordinate amount of time to hear so as to understand the conversation. Walking. Again, your patient is either unable to walk or they require an inordinate amount of time, 90% of the time. Our examples here are your patient is in a wheelchair. Perhaps it could be all of the time. It may be whenever they're outside the home. Or your patient takes an inordinate amount of time to walk. We use a reference of a city block. So perhaps they can't cover that distance without stopping frequently because of shortness of breath or pain, such that they would take an inordinate amount of time to cover that distance of a city block. Elimination, consisting of both bowel and or bladder functions. An example of a marked restriction here would be your patient is incontinent of bowel or bladder functions at least 90% of the time. Or they take an inordinate amount of time to tend to their elimination. And please note, these examples are not exhaustive. The purpose is to give you points of reference. Other basic activities of daily living include feeding. Again, your patient is unable or takes an inordinate amount of time. An example here is your patient relies on tube feeding at least 90% of the time. Or they take an inordinate amount of time to prepare meals to feed themselves on a daily basis due to significant pain and decreased strength and dexterity in their upper limbs. Dressing. Again, your patient is unable to dress, and they may require assistance from another person on a daily basis, or they take an inordinate amount of time due to stiffness, decreased dexterity, perhaps limited range of motion, such that they take an inordinate amount of time, 3 times as long as another person of the same age without the impairment. Mental functions necessary for everyday life. So here we've included several examples, and I want to also let you know that when we talk about mental functions necessary for everyday life, it's not indicated on your slide, but we are referring to memory, problem solving, judgment, decision making, goal setting, and adaptive functions. So all of this makes up mental functions. Now, the examples we have provided pertain mostly to adults here. And the first one is your patient is unable to leave the house due to their anxiety at least 90% of the time, despite medication and therapy. Next, your patient is independent in some aspects of everyday life, or living rather. However, despite medication and therapy, they need daily support and supervision due to an inability to accurately interpret their environment. So the key there is that they really need assistance and supervision on a daily basis. Next, your patient cannot make a common simple transaction, such as buying food at the grocery store, without help. Or your patient is unable to express their needs or anticipate consequences of behavior when interacting with others. So these are examples. Your patient there may be more than one of these that affects your patient. So they all help to make up a marked restriction in mental functions. Moving on to another category of impairment, cumulative effect of significant restrictions. Sounds like quite a mouthful here. If your patient does not quite meet the criteria for a marked restriction, they may be considered eligible for the disability tax credit if they are still greatly or significantly restricted in 2 or more basic activities of daily living, such as vision and 1 or more basic activity of daily living. So we now have an example of cumulative effect of significant restrictions. So in this example, the individual is limited in walking. They can walk 100 meters, but then must take time to recuperate. So in other words, it's taking a lot of their energy. They have a lot of fatigue. Now they can carry out mental functions necessary for everyday life, but they have limitations when it comes to concentrating on any topic for only a short period of time. So together, the cumulative effect of these 2 significant restrictions equal a marked restriction, such as being unable to do 1 basic activity of daily living. Another example, your patient always takes a long time to walk, to dress, and feed. And the extra time it takes them to do these activities, when added together, is equal to being markedly restricted at least 90% of the time in 1 area. Moving on, another category of impairment, life-sustaining therapy. Now, life-sustaining therapy the criteria are very specific. and your patient must meet both of the following criteria. The therapy is needed to support a vital function, even if it eases the symptoms, and the therapy is needed at least 3 times per week for an average of at least 14 hours per week. So a therapy that is intense and it's only once a week, even if it's for more than 14 hours, is not going to meet the criteria. It needs to be 3 times or more for an average of 14 hours per week. It's very specific as per the Income Tax Act. Examples under life-sustaining therapy are an individual or a patient that requires chest physiotherapy to help them breathe, kidney dialysis to filter the blood, insulin therapy to treat type 1 diabetes in a child who cannot independently adjust the insulin dosage. We have a note here that adults who are able to independently manage their insulin therapy would not usually meet that 14-hour per week requirement. And if so, they may have exceptional circumstances or contributing factors where they need help to manage, or they take much longer to manage that helps to support that 14-hour requirement. This chart includes all the medical practitioners and the different areas of categories of impairment and who can certify what. So as nurse practitioners, you are able to certify all of the areas: vision, speaking, hearing, walking, elimination, feeding, dressing, mental functions, life-sustaining therapy, and cumulative effect of significant restrictions. So as in the video, hopefully you can see that it is a simple process, 3 steps to apply for the credit. We do want to point out that there are privately owned companies that assist patients in applying for the disability tax credit. And we do want to let you know they are not associated with the Canada Revenue Agency. Sometimes the names suggest an affiliation, but they are private, they are separate, and they are not the Canada Revenue Agency. And they may ask you for information. Just know that we are separate. Filling out Part B, that is your responsibility as medical practitioners. It can only be filled out by a medical practitioner. We ask that you use your best judgment when certifying the effects of the impairments, but you do not determine eligibility. The CRA does. You are providing the medical information based on the knowledge of your patient. We will use that knowledge to determine whether the patient is eligible. So please assess the patient, compare them to someone of a similar age who has no impairment. For children, consider the developmental milestones of a child of a similar age. Again, to review, how to fill out Part B. Step 1, fill out only the category that applies to your patient. So it may be one area. They may be restricted in just walking, or they may have several areas, and walking, dressing, feeding perhaps, and that may be that they qualify under cumulative. Answer all the questions in each applicable category. Indicate the date on which the marked or the significant restriction began. And I do want to emphasize this. The start date is really when the restriction either became marked or significant, and both of those indicate a level of severity. We often see medical practitioners indicate the date of diagnosis. And if when they were diagnosed, the condition is severe and the effects of impairment are severe, then that would be appropriate. But please note that whatever date you indicate, the individual, the patient, should be severely affected so that they meet the criteria as we have defined for either the marked restriction or the significant restriction. Effects of impairment. The effects of your patient's impairment must be those which cause your patient to be markedly restricted, always substantially all of the time, 90% of the time, even with therapy and the use of appropriate devices and medication. So you indicate on the last page of the form, Part B, is where you indicate the effects of impairment, and these are mandatory. It's your description of how the individual is affected. So if they have a walking impairment, you've provided details on how their walking is limited. If you need more space to describe the effects of impairment, use a separate sheet of paper, sign it, and attach it to the form. Very important that you do sign it so that we know it's coming from you and not a third party. You may include copies of medical reports, diagnostic tests, and any other medical information. And please ensure if you are providing any additional information that it is relevant to that restriction, that it will help to demonstrate that your client is impaired. We sometimes see test results, CAT scans, MRIs, sometimes blood work, and these things are not usually very helpful in determining eligibility. All right, continuing with effects of impairment. Eligibility for the disability tax credit is based on the effects of the impairment, not on the medical condition. Provide sufficient details to demonstrate how the patient's impairment functionally impacts their ability to do one of the applicable basic activities of daily living, 2 or more in the case of cumulative effect, or their need for life-sustaining therapy. Filling out the effects of impairment, here is an example. If your patient is markedly restricted in walking, the details you provide in this section must relate to your patient's ability to walk. Comments on your patient's inability to lift, bend, or do housework are not relevant. So please make it specific to the basic activity of daily living. Filling out duration is mandatory. An impairment has to have lasted or be expected to last for a continuous period of at least 12 months. And this follows for a deceased patient as well. So if you are completing Form T2201 for a patient who is now deceased, your expectation was that they would have been impaired for at least 12 months. All right. You are asked to certify that the information given in Part B of this form is correct and complete. So your certification or signature is an indication of that. CRA's role. The CRA will review the Form T2201 to determine if the patient is eligible for the credit. The CRA's decision is based on the information given by the medical practitioner on the form and on whether the criteria are met, and our criteria are laid out in the Income Tax Act. If further clarification is needed, the CRA may contact the medical practitioner. So you may receive a clarification letter asking for further detail, and it's possible that you may receive a call from one of the medical advisors as well. Usually it's one or the other. Most commonly it's a letter if additional information is being requested. The CRA will send the patient a letter. This is their notice of determination to inform them of the decision and of their options. Fees. The CRA will not provide compensation for filling out the Form T2201. It is your patient's responsibility to cover any associated fees. We do tell them, and it's on our website and on the form, that the patient can claim it as a medical expense, or they have that option. Last page, this is a list of the resources for the disability tax credit, our website, our video. We hope you found that helpful. We have a self-assessment tool. The Form T2201 can be accessed online as well as the guide. The guide has additional information. We have a toll-free phone line for your patients, and we have a dedicated toll-free line for you as nurse practitioners and medical practitioners that complete the form. So please feel free to give our 1-800-280-2639 a call should you have questions about completing the Form T2201. If you have specific questions regarding a specific case, we are more than happy to answer those questions. This line is answered by myself and Stefan and other colleagues in the office who are also registered nurses. And we're always very happy to provide any information that we can. And our goal is to support medical practitioners and ease this process, and your feedback is important to us. So that concludes the presentation. So please feel free to fire up those questions, and we'll answer them. If not today, we will certainly get back to you.
Thank you, Karen, for your presentation. It's now time for a true poll question. I think you're going to see them on the website. We poll a participant just to get to know more about how useful the webinar has been or will be for you in your practice. And as I was discussing with Karen earlier today, she's been speaking to nurse practitioners, so don't hesitate to use the toll-free line that she provided earlier. CNA also developed a fact sheet, a one-page fact sheet that is available on our website in order to assist you when you are completing the forms. We have a few questions that we want to review, and I'm just going to wait till the poll is completed. And very good, really good information for us, and appreciate the participation. So right now, I have a question related to a practitioner who is not sure whether or not their patient meets the criteria for the disability tax credit. Should the practitioner sign the form? And that's a question that's been asked before. So Karen.
Okay. This is a question that I get on the phone line. And what I tell medical practitioners is CRA, we determine the eligibility, so you can feel comfortable to provide the information. If you feel strongly that it is very unlikely because of your knowledge of the form and you're comfortable and you review the form, that they're very unlikely to qualify and you're not comfortable, then you need to address that and let your client or patient know. If you're really not sure, fill it out. Provide all the information that you can, and we will make the determination.
Thank you, Karen. Another question that you are frequently asked is about the eligibility. Is it based on the diagnosis?
Big misconception. It is really based on the effects of impairment. So a diagnosis will affect individuals differently. So the effects of impairment is really what we're looking at, specific to the patient as to how they are impaired in a basic activity of daily living. So it really is helpful when we have specific details to know what the limitations are, whether it be walking, dressing, feeding, elimination, mental functions. Those specifics are what we're looking for. A diagnosis can be helpful, but it in no way determines eligibility. It is the effects of the impairment.
Thank you, Karen. Another question that you provided us is a question around if the patient's medical condition has not been present for at least 12 continuous months. Is this, what happens, is this usually a time limited that the practitioner needs to wait until it's 12 continuous months before completing the form, or what would be your advice?
They don't necessarily have to wait. The expectation is they believe using their medical knowledge, they believe that the impairment will be present for a continuous period of 12 months. Anything can happen. Somebody can die and the form was filled out, or as long as there is that expectation of 12 months, we will review the application.
Okay, that's great, Karen. One last question is about medical practitioners, nurse practitioners wanting to attach additional information to the application. Is that possible to do, and can you provide examples of what could be included in the application?
Okay. We welcome additional medical information that supports the effects of impairment, and we really like to see that it is specific. Information, as I said, test results often don't help. An example would be blood work or CAT scan results. Information that highlights where the restrictions are or the limitations in that basic activity of daily living is really what we're looking for. The information needs to be identified that it is coming from a medical practitioner, so we're looking for a signature and a date, a stamp if possible, and we're not looking for lengthy records. I've received calls from doctors' offices and they've got 200 pages that they want to send me, and I say, please don't. It's to no one's benefit, but please provide the information, and if you need to do a summary or highlight certain passages, that's appreciated. It needs to be specific and relevant to the limitation, signed, dated. And if you have any questions other than, about that in particular, feel free to give us a call.
So we're going to go over another question related to patients with cognitive impairments, and a question on the nurse practitioner who may diagnose dementia. Is it correct that I can only state onset of impairment from when I have been involved with their care or diagnose them? So that's a very specific question around the application.
Okay.
The form.
On the form T2201, we do ask how long have you been the provider for this patient, so your involvement. So that date is on the form. But you can certainly attest to the impairment prior to the date when you were involved if you have that information. So you can say, based on patient history, the cognitive impairment goes back 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, and if you have information to support, even better, so that if the start date is a few years prior to when you knew the patient, any information, medical information that you have in the file or that the client or patient can provide will help to support that start date. I hope that answers that.
Thank you, Karen. That's all for today's webinar. We really encourage you to email Canada Revenue by phone, and we do hope that this webinar provided additional information on how to complete the form. Thank you for your time, and the webinar recording is available, and you can also download your certificate of participation using the following information, and we are pleased to share the dates of the next CNA biennium from June 18th to 20th next year, and the upcoming webinar in November will be on medical assisted dying.